The transmission came in at 3:47 in the morning, and the first thing Deputy Clara Reyes noticed was that it wasn't broadcasting on any frequency that should exist. She was alone in the Harlan County Sheriff's office when the radio started doing it, not static, not interference, but something beneath those things, something that felt like the electromagnetic equivalent of a scream held just below hearing. The lights in the office dimmed once, then steadied. The coffee maker on the counter made a sound like it was trying to remember what it was for. Clara sat very still in Sheriff Dale Booker's chair. He let her use it on overnight shifts, said it was more comfortable for her bad hip, and she listened to the frequency that shouldn't exist for exactly 4 seconds before she reached for her notepad and wrote down the time. That was the thing about Clara Reyes. She always wrote down the time. She didn't call anyone for 11 minutes. Not because she was frightened, though she was. Not because she was in shock, though part of her understood later that shock had been present the whole time, working quietly in the background like a second dispatcher she'd never hired. She didn't call anyone for 11 minutes because she was thinking. Because the sound the radio was making had a pattern, and Clara Reyes had spent 22 years in law enforcement learning that patterns mean something, and that the first person to understand a pattern usually decides how the situation ends. She was still thinking when the lights over Miller's Field, 6 miles due east of the office, just past the old Pentecostal church and the grain elevator that hadn't worked in a decade, went from nothing to everything. She saw it through the window. Everyone in Harlan, Missouri saw it. 4,700 people, most of them asleep, most of them dreaming ordinary dreams about debt and weather, and the small familiar aches of lives lived close to the ground. And then the sky above Miller's Field went from black to white to a color that Clara later struggled to describe to the federal agents who arrived on the third day. She told them it was like looking at the moment just before a photograph develops. The color of potential. The color of something that hasn't decided what it is yet. She had already picked up her phone and dialed Dale Booker's number before the light fully resolved. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Dale," he said, "I see it." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Outside, a dog somewhere in town was barking with a sound that was almost philosophical in its urgency. A car alarm had triggered 3 streets over. These were the sounds of the ordinary world registering that something had changed but not yet understanding what. Dale said, "How long?" 11 minutes since the radio started. I wrote it down." "Good." A pause. "I'm coming in." "Dale," she stopped him. "I think we should drive out there first, before anyone else does." Another pause, longer. Dale Booker was 61 years old and had been sheriff of Harlan County for 19 years. He had the kind of face that furniture eventually gets worn smooth by use, functional in its patience, quietly authoritative in ways that have nothing to do with trying. He was not a dramatic man. He thought about things before he said them, and he said fewer things than most people, and the things he said tended to last. "All right," he said, "pick me up." She was already reaching for her keys. They drove out on Route 9 with the lights off. Clara's idea. She couldn't explain it exactly, but something about the frequency still humming distantly in her memory made her think that announcing themselves with flashing red and blue would be the wrong tone, like showing up to a funeral with balloons. There was a register to the situation that she was still calibrating, and until she understood it better, she wanted to approach it quietly. The ship, she had decided privately to use that word, because there was no other word and precision mattered, was sitting in Miller's Field at a slight angle, as though it had landed on terrain it hadn't perfectly anticipated. It was large. Clara had trouble afterward agreeing with herself about how large, because the size seemed to shift depending on which part of it she was looking at. Her best estimate, which she included in her report, was approximately 400 feet across and perhaps 60 feet at its highest point. It was roughly disc-shaped but not perfectly, the way a coin is disc-shaped, but a coin is also more than its shape. It had texture. It had what appeared to be structural logic. It looked engineered the way a bridge looks engineered, not accidentally functional, but deliberately, expensively, intelligently so. The color of potential had faded. The ship was now something closer to the color of old iron, except that old iron doesn't occasionally shift the way heat shimmer shifts, and old iron doesn't make your back teeth feel like they're being politely consulted about something. Dale got out of the cruiser first. He had his hat on. He was wearing the hat he always wore, the brown felt one with the crease he'd put in it himself 20 years ago. He stood at the edge of the field and looked at the ship the way he looked at everything, thoroughly, without performance, with the particular quality of attention that comes from genuinely needing to understand something rather than simply needing to appear as though you do. Clara stood beside him. She had her hand near her holster, not on it. She had made a decision about that on the drive out. Her hand near her holster was a habit, a posture, a professional reflex that meant alert. Her hand on her holster meant threat. She didn't want to mean threat yet. She didn't know enough to mean threat yet. Nothing happened for 6 minutes. Then a portion of the ship's surface changed. It didn't open exactly. It was more like watching a soap bubble membrane decide to become a door. The transition was smooth in a way that human engineering never achieves because human engineering always leaves evidence of effort. This left no evidence of effort. It simply was a surface, and then it was an opening, and the opening had been inevitable in the way that only perfect things are inevitable. What came through the opening was not what Clara had expected, which was interesting because she later realized she couldn't articulate what she had expected. She had expected something. She got something else. There were 3 of them. They were tall, perhaps 8 feet, though the same perceptual strangeness that affected her sense of the ship's size made her uncertain. They moved on what appeared to be 4 lower limbs and used 2 upper limbs for other purposes. Their surface was not skin exactly, but it served the function of skin, the way a diplomat serves the function of communication, technically, precisely, with something held back. Their coloring was a deep arterial red that shifted toward violet at their extremities. They had no visible faces in the way that Clara understood faces, but there was a region at the top of their bodies that was clearly oriented toward her, clearly processing her, in a way that made the word face feel like it still applied even though nothing about it looked like one. They stopped at the edge of the ship's ramp. Dale Booker walked toward them. Clara said, "Dale." He said, "Yep," and kept walking. He stopped about 30 feet from them. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him, not as a gesture of submission. Clara knew him well enough to know he didn't have submission gestures, but as a gesture of being unarmed, of having hands that were occupied with something harmless, of being a person who had come here to talk and not to fight. He said, "Evening. I'm Dale Booker, Sheriff of Harlan County. This here's my county. You've landed on private property which we'll set aside for the moment. I'd appreciate knowing your intentions." The 3 beings looked at him. Later, when the xenolinguists and the military analysts and the various federal representatives reviewed the footage from the cruiser's dashcam, they would spend considerable time discussing what happened next. Not what the beings did. They didn't do anything immediately visible. What the analysts spent time discussing was the 11-second pause before one of the beings made the first sound, and what the sound appeared to mean within the context of their communication system, which the analysts didn't begin to decode for another 3 weeks. But Clara was there. And Clara had 22 years of watching people respond to things, and she saw it. The beings were startled, not frightened, not threatened, startled. The way you're startled when something happens in a sequence you didn't predict, when the pattern breaks before it was supposed to break. She saw it in the slight adjustment of their posture, in the way the second one's upper limbs moved a fraction inward before going still again, in the barely perceptible shift in the orientation of the one that was clearly in some form of command position. The way it recalibrated, the way it reconsidered. What had startled them, she thought later, was the hat. Not the hat specifically, but the gesture, the deliberate disarmament, the choice, the evidence of interpretation that Dale had looked at them and arrived at a judgment about what would communicate correctly and acted on that judgment, and the judgment had been nuanced enough that it registered as something unexpected. They had not anticipated nuance, or they had anticipated a different kind of nuance, or they had anticipated something else entirely. And Dale Booker standing in a field at 4 in the morning, holding his hat in both hands with the quiet confidence of a man who has handled difficult situations before, had violated some prediction they'd carried with them from wherever they'd come. The realization moved through Clara quietly, the way cold moves through a house in winter, not announcing itself, just present, just changing the temperature of everything. They had expected something different from the first responder. She didn't know exactly what. She suspected she wouldn't know for a long time. But they had modeled this moment, and Dale had stepped outside the model, and that had mattered. Somehow, without knowing anything about them, without knowing their language or their history or their physics or their intentions, Dale Booker had already done something they didn't expect. She wrote the time in her notepad, 4:23 a.m. The federal people arrived at 11:15 that morning, which was faster than Clara had thought possible and slower than the situation seemed to require. They came in black SUVs and government vans, and one vehicle that appeared to have been repurposed from a satellite communications role that she didn't recognize. They brought people in suits and people in uniforms and people in neither, which was the category that always made Clara most attentive, because people who wore neither when everyone else was wearing one or the other were usually the ones actually running things. By that point, Dale had been standing in Miller's Field for 6 hours and 48 minutes. He had not approached the ship again. He had not retreated from his position. He had sent Clara back to town at sunrise to manage what was already becoming a situation: residents at the perimeter, 3 local journalists, a man from the next county over who had heard on the radio and driven 40 miles in his pajamas. She had managed all of it. She had been calm and specific, and had told people what they needed to know and not what they didn't, which in law enforcement is most of what crowd management actually is. But she had kept one eye on the field. Dale stood there. The ship sat there. Occasionally something would happen at the ship's opening, a shift of light, a suggestion of movement, and Dale would watch it, and nothing would proceed from the watching, and then everything would go still again. He drank from a thermos Clara had brought him at 6. He used the bathroom once briefly, behind the cruiser, which she found later she had a complicated feelings about: the mundane persistence of a human body during an event of cosmic significance, the way the body just keeps making its demands regardless, the way Dale had clearly just factored it in as a logistical element and handled it without ceremony. The federal people tried to relieve him. The man in charge of the federal contingent, he introduced himself as Coordinator Marsh. No first name offered, came to Clara and explained, with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed, that they would be taking over point contact from here. Clara said, "He won't move." Marsh said, "He's a county sheriff." Clara said, "Yes." Marsh studied her for a moment. "We have protocols." "He's been there almost 7 hours, Clara said. "They know him." Whatever that means for beings like this, they've spent 7 hours knowing him. You send someone new out there now and you're telling them everything they've learned about the situation isn't the situation anymore. She paused. "That's my assessment." Marsh looked at her with an expression that was working hard to remain neutral. "And you base that on what, deputy?" 22 years, she said. He didn't move Dale. She wasn't sure if it was because he'd weighed her argument and found it sound, or because Dale simply hadn't moved when approached, and there was no protocol for physically removing a sitting sheriff from a field in front of a vessel of non-human origin while said vessel's occupants were observing. Either way, Dale stayed. The first communication attempt from the federal team happened at 2:14 p.m. It was sophisticated. She was told mathematical sequences, encoded light pulses, a package of information compressed into a format designed by some of the best minds in xenolinguistic theory over 20 years of thinking about what this moment might look like. The ship ignored it, not with hostility, not with dismissal exactly, more the way you ignore something that's talking to you in a language you don't speak, not a choice to ignore, but a failure of the signal to register as signal at all. At 2:31 p.m., the being that Clara had identified as the command position figure came to the opening of the ship again and stood there looking toward the field, looking toward Dale. Clara was watching through binoculars from the perimeter when she saw Dale notice. He lifted one hand, not a wave, not a salute, just a slight raising of the hand, the gesture of a person who sees another person and acknowledges the seeing, the sort of thing you do when you pass your neighbor on the street. The most ordinary gesture in the human vocabulary. The command being was still for a moment. Then it did something with one of its upper limbs that Clara couldn't decode, but that felt. She wrote this in her notes and crossed it out and wrote it again like an answer. Marsh, watching beside her, said quietly, "What just happened?" Clara said, "I think they're talking." "That's not possible. We haven't established." "Not with words," she said. "On the second day, a girl went missing. Her name was Petra Salas, 11 years old, daughter of Martin and Connie Salas, who ran the feed store on Caldwell Street. She had slipped through the perimeter at approximately 9 p.m., in the gap between two federal agents who had stepped away simultaneously, one for a bathroom break, one to take a radio call, and which was not, Clara reflected, a coincidence, because Petra Salas had been watching that perimeter for 12 hours, and she was 11, and therefore had nothing but time and attention, and the particular kind of focused determination that children apply to things they've decided they need to do. Clara found out about it at 9:23. She found Petra at 9:51. The girl was sitting in the field approximately 40 feet from the ship, and she was not alone. One of the beings, not the command figure, one of the others, the smallest of the three, which still meant something around 7.5 feet, had come out. It was sitting too, or the closest approximation to sitting that its physiology allowed. It was oriented toward Petra. Petra had her hands folded in her lap, and she was talking to it in the steady, earnest, slightly too loud way that children talk to things they're not sure can hear them. Clara stopped. She stood at the edge of where the field's tall grass met the shorter grass of the cleared landing area, and she watched. And she did not intervene, because something in her, the 22 years, the pattern reading, the thing she trusted even when she couldn't explain it, told her that intervening would be the wrong move. Petra was saying, "And my teacher says we have 100 billion stars in just our galaxy, and there's more galaxies than people have ever been able to count, so I figure you must have come really far. That's a long trip. Did you get bored?" The being made a sound, low, resonant, with harmonics that seemed to operate independently of each other. Clara felt it in her chest before she heard it with her ears. Petra tilted her head. "I don't know what that means," she said reasonably, "but it's okay. I talk to my grandma on video calls, and sometimes the signal's bad and I can't understand her either, and we still have good conversations." Marsh arrived beside Clara at some point. She didn't register exactly when. He stood next to her watching. She expected him to order the extraction. He didn't. For nearly 3 minutes he was silent. Then he said very quietly, "How is she not scared?" Clara thought about it. "She's 11, she said. "She's curious." Those two things are kind of the same at that age. Marsh looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she didn't have a word for. Then he looked back at the field. "They're not scared of her," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Clara said. "They were scared of us, the contact team, the equipment." He said it slowly, working it out. "But not her." "Not Dale either," Clara said. "Not scared, but they weren't prepared for him either. There's a difference." She paused. "I think they had a model of what they'd find here, what we'd be like, how this would go. And every time someone acts outside the model, it costs them something, like having to rewrite a calculation mid-problem. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Where are you getting this?" "People," she said. "Just people." Petra was eventually brought back to her parents at 10:47 p.m. after the being had withdrawn gradually, unhurriedly into the ship. She was completely unharmed. She ate 2 granola bars and told her mother the being had communicated something to her using what she described as colors that weren't outside. They were inside. And the federal team spent 4 hours trying to unpack that sentence and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. On the morning of the third day, Dale Booker collapsed. He had been standing in the field for 31 hours. Not continuously. He had been permitted, eventually, a cot near the perimeter, and he had slept for 2 hours sometime around midnight, and Clara had brought him food which he had eaten methodically and without complaint. But he had returned to his position in the field afterward, and when the sun came up on the third day and the command figure appeared again at the opening of the ship, Dale had been there waiting, and they had resumed whatever it was they were doing, which was not conversation exactly, but was not conversation either. He collapsed at 6:14 a.m. His blood pressure, the paramedics told Clara. Not heart attack, not stroke. Exhaustion and blood pressure, a combination his 61-year-old body had apparently decided it was done negotiating around. Clara was at his side before the paramedics finished their sentence. He was conscious. His eyes were open and tracking. He looked at her with the calm, unhurried expression he'd worn for most of the last 3 days and said, "Don't let them move me." She said, "Dale, Clara." His voice was level. "I need you to hear me. Don't let them move me yet. You need a hospital. I need 5 minutes." He turned his head toward the ship. The command figure was still at the opening. It had not moved when Dale collapsed, but something had changed in its posture, the slight inward shift of its upper limbs that Clara was beginning to understand as its equivalent of leaning forward, its equivalent of attention sharpening. 5 minutes, Dale said. "Then you can take me." She looked at him. She looked at the ship. She felt the weight of 22 years pressing down on her, and the weight of this moment pressing down on all of it. 4, she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come in 3 days. He turned back to the ship and he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He raised his hand again, the same slight raise, the same neighbor on the street gesture, but this time he pointed to himself. And then he pointed toward the town, and then he pointed back to himself. Slow. Deliberate. The careful sign language of a person who knows the other party, doesn't speak their language, but believes communication is still possible if you're willing to work at it, if you're willing to be patient, if you're willing to trust that the other party is also trying. The command figure was still for a long moment. Then it stepped back from the opening. Not inside, it stood just at the threshold. And it raised one upper limb, and it made the gesture that Clara had seen it make on the first morning in response to Dale's raised hand, the gesture she had understood as an answer. It looked like acknowledgement. It looked like the equivalent of "I see you. I understand you're going." Dale lowered his hand. He let the paramedics help him up. He didn't say anything else. Clara watched the command figure watch Dale being helped toward the ambulance. She watched the way it stood at the threshold, not advancing, not retreating, waiting, remaining visible, ensuring that Dale could see it seeing him go. Something contracted in her chest, something she wasn't prepared for. They took him to Harlan County General, which was 20 minutes away, and his blood pressure stabilized within the hour. And the attending physician told him in terms that were professional in their firmness that he needed at least 48 hours of monitored rest. And Dale had listened to all of this with the same patient attention he gave everything, and had then asked for his hat and his phone. Clara drove back to Miller's Field. She stood at the edge of the cleared area and looked at the ship for a long time. The command figure was no longer visible. The opening was still there, the soap bubble membrane door suspended in its state of having decided to be open. Then she put on Dale's hat because her hair was a disaster and the sun was coming up and she needed to see, and she walked out into the field. She stopped at Dale's position, 30 feet from the ramp. She waited. For 19 minutes, nothing happened. Then the command figure came to the opening. Clara stood there. She was 44 years old and she had a hip that complained in cold weather, and she was running on approximately 6 hours of sleep over 3 days, and she was wearing her dead father's deputy badge and Dale's hat, and she was aware, deeply frightened. Not of the ship, not of the beings. She was frightened in the way you're frightened when something enormous rests on a decision and you can feel the weight of it but not its shape. She thought about what Dale had done, what Petra had done, what had worked and what hadn't, and what the difference seemed to be. She reached into her pocket and she took out her notepad, the one where she'd been writing times. She held it up so the command figure could see it. Then she flipped to the first page, 3:47 a.m. She pointed to it. She pointed to the ship. She mimed the radio making sounds, a child's pantomime of listening, of hearing something. She pointed to the time again. She turned to the next page, 4:23 a.m. Pointed to the position where Dale had stood, pointed to the time. She turned page by page, all the times she'd written, all 37 of them. Every moment she'd documented, from the first frequency anomaly through Dale's collapse this morning, offered without commentary, without framing, just evidence of attention. Evidence that someone had been paying attention from the very first second, that the record existed, that they had been seen and the seeing had been kept. The command figure was still. Then it did something she hadn't seen it do. It moved closer, not to the edge of the ramp, into the field, 10 steps from the ramp, 10 steps it had not taken in 3 days of interaction with the most sophisticated xenocontact team the federal government could assemble. It stopped. It raised one upper limb. In its hand, in the structure at the end of its limb, it was holding something, small, flat, the exact dimensions of her notepad. She stared at it. It held it out toward her in the same gesture she'd used, the same plainness, the same absence of performance. Her throat tightened. They had records too. They had been keeping records too, from the moment they arrived. And they had just told her that they had been telling her that they had been paying attention too, that the seeing had gone both ways, that they had been documenting this just as she had been documenting this. And something about the symmetry of it. The most advanced civilization she could imagine, and a county deputy in a borrowed hat, both of them just writing things down so they wouldn't lose them, made her eyes sting in a way she didn't try to stop. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice right then. The command figure made the answer gesture, the I see you gesture, and then it did something new. It opened the object it was holding, the way she had opened the notepad, and it showed her what was inside. She couldn't read it. Of course she couldn't read it. The symbols meant nothing to her. But she could see that there were many of them, close together, careful, the visual evidence of sustained attention, of documentation, of someone deciding that what was happening here was worth recording precisely and completely. She took a breath. She said, "My name is Clara Reyes. I'm the deputy. Dale's my sheriff. He's going to be okay." She paused. "I don't know if you understand any of that, but I think you understand some of it." The harmonics came again, low, resonant, layered. She let herself feel them. She didn't flinch from them this time. She said, "I think you came here with a picture of what this was going to be like, and I think we keep not being that." She looked down at her notepad, then back up. "I can't promise we'll make more sense the longer you stay. I honestly think we might make less, but I can promise we'll keep showing up. That's basically what we do." The command figure was very still. Then it made a sound she hadn't heard before. Shorter, a different register, something that the xenolinguists would later determine, after weeks of analysis, was the equivalent of a very specific word in their language. A word with no perfect translation. The closest approximation in English was something between acknowledgement and warning and recognition all at once. Something like, "I have updated my understanding of you and the update is not complete, and I suspect it will never be complete, and I am uncertain whether that terrifies me or compels me. In their language, apparently, those were not different things. The federal debrief took 11 days. Clara gave testimony for 7 of them. Marsh sat across from her in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and institutional carpeting, and he asked her questions with the careful precision of someone assembling a picture from pieces he didn't yet know how to value, and she answered them as completely as she could. On the 7th day, he set down his pen. He said, "I want to understand what you think happened out there." She thought about it. "I think they came here with a threat model," she said, "a picture of what they'd encounter. Maybe they've done first contact before. Maybe they've developed frameworks for it, protocols, the way we had protocols." She let that sit for a moment. "And then they landed in a field in rural Missouri at 4 in the morning, and the first person to show up was a 61-year-old county sheriff who took his hat off." Marsh said nothing. "And the second person who really got through to them was an 11-year-old girl who wanted to know if they'd gotten bored on the trip." Clara looked at the table. "They were building a picture of us. What kind of species we were, whether we were dangerous, how we'd respond, and they kept collecting data that didn't fit the picture. Every time they thought they understood us, one of us did something that didn't compute. Dale just standing there, Petra just talking, me with the notepad." She paused. "I think what disturbed them most wasn't any one thing. It was the accumulation, the consistency of the inconsistency. We kept being unpredictable in ways they couldn't find the pattern for." Marsh said, "They left on the morning of day 8. I know. They gave us a coordinate set. The xenomathematics team says it's a location approximately 40 light years from here." He was watching her carefully. "They're inviting us somewhere." Clara absorbed this. You don't seem surprised." "I think they want to keep studying us," she said, "in a setting they can control better. Somewhere they can put us in a box and figure us out." A pause. "I don't think they're going to figure us out." "No," Marsh said slowly. "Neither do I." He picked up his pen again, then set it back down. "The linguists have been working on the recording of the sound the command figure made, the last one before they withdrew." He looked at her. "The translation is preliminary, but they think it was something like a categorization marker, a formal designation. The way their documentation system classifies something new." Clara waited. "The best translation they can produce," he said, "is something like persistent irrational continuing, or maybe that which does not stop when it should." He paused. "They classified humanity, and that's what they called us." The conference room was very quiet. Clara thought about Dale in the field, 31 hours on his feet. Petra sitting across from something 8 feet tall that communicated in colors you felt on the inside. Herself standing there with a notepad and a borrowed hat. Because what else do you do? Because you show up and you pay attention and you write down the times. Because that's what you have. Because that's what humans have always had, not the right equipment, not the right knowledge, not the right anything, just the willingness to stay. She thought about the coordinates set, 40 light years away. She thought about whatever was there waiting. She thought about what it would be like to be a civilization that had traveled the stars and done first contact before and had a framework for it, a model for it, a set of predictions. And then to encounter something that blew through the model, not with firepower, not with technology, not with cunning, but with sheer relentless continuance. With the inability, the almost biological inability, to decide that a situation was impossible and stop engaging with it. With the persistent and slightly irrational faith that if you just kept showing up, kept paying attention, kept writing down the times, eventually something would happen. Something would connect. Something would mean something. They were not the most powerful species. They were not the most intelligent. They were not, in any measurable sense, the most equipped for what the galaxy contained. They were just the ones who kept coming back. She said, "Are we going to go to the coordinates?" Marsh picked up his pen. "That's above my clearance." She looked at him. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come. Dale came back to work 6 weeks later. The doctor had recommended 8 weeks. Dale had managed 6 and then showed up in the office on a Tuesday morning with his hat and his thermos and sat down behind his desk and looked at the stack of work that had accumulated and got started on it, because the county didn't stop having needs just because the universe had expanded. Clara was at her desk across the room. She watched him sort through the mail. She watched him drink his coffee. She watched him do the absolute ordinary sacred nothing of a person resuming a life. She said, "They named us." He looked up. The translation came back, what the command one said at the end, what they put in their records. She folded her hands on the desk. Persistent, irrational, continuing. That's what they called us. Dale thought about it. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking. "Could be worse," he said. "Yeah," she said. Outside, Harlan was going about its day. The feed store was open. The grain elevator that hadn't worked in a decade was still not working. 3 kids on bikes were doing something inadvisable near the park. The sky was blue and enormous and full of things that were moving toward them or away from them, or watching them from distances that made the word distance feel inadequate. Clara opened her notepad to a fresh page. She wrote down the time. Somewhere, 40 light-years away, at coordinates that a civilization had taken 3 days to decide to share, something was waiting to see what humanity would do next. Something that had updated its understanding and found the update insufficient and suspected it always would be. Something that had watched a man stand in a field for 31 hours and a child ask if they'd gotten bored on the trip, and a deputy hold up a notepad as if to say, "We were paying attention too. We were always paying attention. This is what we do. We pay attention and we write it down and we come back and we keep coming back. Even when there's no reason to believe coming back will change anything. Even when the blood pressure spikes and the hip aches and the radio makes sounds that shouldn't exist. Even then. Especially then." The galaxy had a name for this behavior. They had not yet decided if it was a comfort or a warning. Perhaps, in time, they would understand that for humanity, those had never been different things either.